Hey guys, tonight we step into the cold stone corridors of the Tower of London, the kind of place where echoes hang longer than your own shadow, and the air smells faintly of old candles, damp mortar, and the nervous sweat of centuries-old secrets. You trudge past arrow slits and looming towers, feeling the weight of history pressing down. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. Or at least, you won't survive it without a shiver crawling up your spine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm always curious where in the world my fellow history explorers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1483 London, and the air is thick with anticipation and dread. Two young boys, Edward V, barely 13, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, aged just 9, are about to enter the most famous fortress in England, not as visitors, but as residents. Their father, King Edward IV, has died suddenly, leaving the kingdom's crown dangling precariously in the hands of a child. The streets of London murmur with rumors, merchants whisper in the marketplace, and courtiers exchange secretive glances in candlelit chambers. Outside, the Thames glints like a silver snake, winding past the tower, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on its banks. You can almost feel the prince's shoes scuffing against the uneven cobblestones, their small hands gripping cloaks too heavy for their age, unaware of the web of ambition already spinning around them. Courtiers bow, murmur, "God save the king." And yet the word king feels strange, empty almost, when it belongs to a boy who has barely learned Latin declensions. There's a strange sort of theater to it all. Processions, guards, heralds, trumpets. Yet behind the polished ceremony, shadows twist. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, their uncle, watches silently. Historians still argue whether he is a protective guardian or a predator cloaked in family loyalty. Inside the tower, the cold stone walls seem to absorb the chatter and spit it back as hollow echoes. Torches sputter in wall sconces, and the scent of damp stone mixes with wax and wood smoke. You can almost hear the boys' quiet footsteps on the spiral staircases, the soft murmur of their tutors reading aloud, the nervous whisper of attendants shifting uneasily. The tower is not merely a building. It's a living, breathing witness to centuries of power struggles, betrayals, and disappearances. Even in 1483, it already has a reputation for swallowing princes whole, at least metaphorically. Quirky fact: some courtiers claimed the walls themselves whispered secrets to those who dared listen closely at night. Whether that's true or just tower folklore, you can feel the chill anyway. London itself is a city of contrasts. Busy markets with smells of roasting meat, horse dung, and fresh bread mingle with the quiet gloom of narrow alleys. Merchants sell spices from far-off lands, and street performers juggle knives or recite bawdy tales, oblivious to the brewing royal drama. Outside the tower gates, the city seems alive, even hopeful, yet inside, the air feels stilled, trapped, like the world is holding its breath. You can picture the princes peeking nervously through tiny windows, perhaps imagining adventures they will never have. Their small hands pressed against cold iron bars. As the evening settles, the tower transforms from fortress to cage. Guards patrol with measured steps, keys jingling in a rhythmic warning. Torches flare against stone, casting long, wavering shadows that seem almost human. The young princes, aware only in part of their delicate position, might have whispered questions to one another, words lost to history. Mainstream accounts suggest they were treated with care, but under constant supervision. Quirky details from later chronicles hint that Edward V had a small pet bird he would speak to for comfort, a tiny rebellion of innocence in a grim place. You can imagine him leaning against the wall, whispering secrets to a blue tit, while shadows stretch long around him. And yet, the tower is a place of contradictions. It is home to treasure, a royal mint, and high-born prisoners alike. It hums with political tension, the chatter of pages, and the metallic clang of armor. Every stone seems to whisper. Every corridor hides a plot. You, standing in the middle of it all, in your imagination, can almost feel the nervous pulse of the city outside and the suffocating stillness within. It is here, in these walls, that our story begins, not with action, but with presence, with a sense of looming fate. Historians still argue whether the boys sensed the danger that was creeping toward them, or whether they were blissfully naive, trusting their uncle in a world where loyalty is rarely simple. In these opening moments, we meet not just princes, but children on the edge of history, whose very existence will haunt the imagination of generations. You might notice, if you close your eyes, the faint scrape of a servant's shoe on flagstone, the whisper of a distant gate, the chill that seems to seep into your bones. It's a world alive with textures, smells, and whispers, both comforting and terrifying. The Tower of London is more than stone and mortar. It's a prelude to mystery, to power, to shadows that will stretch centuries beyond the boys themselves. So you settle in, lean back, let the gentle hum of the fan and the imagined flicker of torchlight lull you closer to the story's edge, where innocence meets ambition and history waits to unfold. The morning sun filters through the tall, narrow windows of Westminster Palace, brushing the polished wooden floors with streaks of gold. You step lightly into the bustling household of Edward IV's children, where laughter and chaos mingle with the measured etiquette of court life. Edward V, already tall for his age, adjusts his doublet nervously, while his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, fidgets with the hem of his tunic. You can almost hear the quiet squeak of leather shoes across polished boards and the faint rustle of silk as attendants move past, balancing trays of warm bread and spiced wine. The court smells like a mixture of candle wax, polished wood, and the faint tang of perfumes designed to mask less pleasant realities, like unwashed hair or the lingering odor of ale from the kitchens. Life for the princes is a curious mixture of privilege and restriction. Tutors guide Edward through Latin declensions, arithmetic, and the rudiments of chivalry, while Richard is encouraged to emulate his older brother, learning to hold a quill just so, or bow at precisely the right angle. Mainstream historians note that these boys were exceptionally well educated for their time, raised in the lap of luxury, but drilled with discipline. Quirky detail. Some accounts claim Edward had a small collection of toy soldiers carved from wood, which he would arrange in mock battles on his desk, shouting commands and arguing with his imaginary generals. You can almost see him, brow furrowed, tiny hand guiding a soldier across a velvet-covered tabletop, imagining victories that could never be fully his. The day-to-day routine of court life is a constant performance. Meals are formal affairs, with servants pouring wine from silver flagons and presenting dishes of roasted meats, pies, and sweetmeats. You can almost smell the rich aroma of roasted pheasant mixed with the faintly sour tang of overripe fruit. A reminder that even palaces have their imperfections. Edward and Richard are taught to navigate this intricate world of etiquette, to recognize which bow is appropriate for which noble, which smile hides envy, and which compliment is laced with poison. Historians still argue whether the prince's education emphasized intellect over politics, or if it subtly prepared them to survive in a world where loyalty is often a mask for ambition. Play is interspersed with formality, a brief respite from the constant awareness of their station. The younger Richard is prone to mischief, pulling a prank on a startled page or hiding behind a tapestry to watch courtiers trip over their elaborate robes. Edward, while slightly more restrained, enjoys these moments of levity, laughing quietly at his brother's antics. Quirky fact: one chronicler claimed Edward kept a tame monkey that he trained to mimic the gestures of visiting nobles, a tiny rebellion against courtly rigidity. You can almost picture the creature chittering from its perch, while the princes suppress giggles behind their hands. Outside the palace walls, the streets of London pulse with energy. Merchants shout their wares, spices from Venice, cloth from Flanders, while street performers juggle knives or recite poetry for coins. You can almost feel the vibration of the city through the palace floors. The smells of roasting meat and fresh bread drifting upward, mixing with the scent of polished wood and candle wax inside. This world is a stark contrast to the controlled environment of the court, a reminder that the prince's upbringing is carefully insulated, even as the wider kingdom teems with life and danger. Every visitor to the court is an opportunity for both learning and peril. Courtiers approach with measured steps, offering gifts of gold or exotic goods, each handshake potentially concealing ambition, each compliment possibly masking envy. Edward learns quickly to accept smiles that are not genuine, to nod politely while calculating the intentions behind every word. Richard, less cautious but no less observant, develops a keen sense of the court's undercurrents, noticing which servants whisper secrets, which knights linger too long, and which noble eyes follow the boys with more curiosity than courtesy. Despite the lessons, there are moments of innocence that shine through. A garden tucked away behind the palace walls offers sun-drenched relief, the scent of roses and freshly turned soil filling the air. The princes run freely here, Edward's laughter mixing with the soft cooing of doves, Richard chasing a butterfly or two into the shadows of a yew hedge. It is in these moments that the vulnerability of their age is most apparent, and you can almost feel a pang of unease, knowing that these carefree hours are numbered. Even their interactions with servants carry subtle layers. Pages fetch books, pour water into silver basins, and attend to the prince's every whim, all while listening, learning, and sometimes conspiring. Mainstream accounts suggest some attendants were loyal, while others were quietly ambitious, testing the boy's patience and reactions. Quirky detail. A chronicler mentions a servant who would slip notes of advice into Edward's meals, small words of caution about which nobles could be trusted or avoided entirely. You can imagine Edward reading a folded scrap of parchment under the table, heart racing with the thrill of secret knowledge, little realizing how perilous the palace truly is. Historians still argue whether the princes sensed the threat gathering around them at this young age, or whether they remained blissfully ignorant, trusting in their uncle and the ceremonial protections of the court. You, imagining their day-to-day lives, feel the tension, a mixture of laughter, study, and the creeping awareness that power is a game often decided by those too old or too ambitious to play fairly. And so the young princes continue their days, balancing education, play, and the unspoken rules of a court that observes, judges, and manipulates in equal measure. You can almost hear the faint echo of Edward correcting Richard's Latin, the soft scrape of quill against parchment, the chitter of a pet monkey somewhere in the shadows, and the distant hum of London streets beyond the palace walls. It is a world both enchanting and perilous, a stage set for innocence to meet ambition, and for history to begin taking note of two boys who may be destined for more than just childhood games. The air in Westminster Palace is unusually still that morning, a heavy quiet that presses on your shoulders and makes your footsteps sound unnaturally loud across the stone floors. You trudge into the king's chambers, where Edward IV lies in his bed, still draped in rich silks, the gold embroidery catching the weak light like it's mocking the living. Candles gutter as if sensing the gravity of the moment, wax dripping in slow, deliberate tears. The court is abuzz with whispers, but the sound is hollow, like a distant river muffled by stone walls. You probably won't survive the shock when you hear the news. The king is dead, struck down suddenly by illness at the age of 40. A chill slides down your spine, because here, in these halls, death is rarely simple, and power is never safely inherited. Edward IV's death sets off immediate turmoil. Courtiers freeze mid-step, attendants exchange anxious glances, and the young princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, are suddenly thrust into the heart of a political hurricane they do not yet understand. You can almost feel their small hands gripping the edges of chairs, knuckles white, as advisors whisper of regencies, guardianships, and the necessary protection of the realm. Mainstream historical accounts suggest that the king had been in reasonably good health, and his sudden passing may have been exacerbated by the stress of ruling a kingdom perpetually teetering on civil unrest. Quirky detail. Some chroniclers later speculated that Edward had been poisoned by a rare combination of herbs intended to calm his stomach. An early Tudor conspiracy theory that reads like something out of a medieval detective novel. The palace transforms instantly. Hallways that once echoed with playful footsteps of pages and servants now hum with tension. You can almost hear the hurried whispers behind tapestries, the soft jingle of keys, and the metallic clatter of armored guards shifting positions to anticipate unrest. Courtiers scramble to assert influence over the young king, Edward III, now a boy thrust into a role far beyond his years. Decisions that would normally take weeks are made in moments. Who will be the regent? Who controls the treasury? And who stands closest to the throne? Historians still argue whether Edward IV's sudden death was natural or aided by human hands, a question that continues to ripple through the shadows of Tudor scholarship. The death of a monarch also brings out human idiosyncrasies in unexpected ways. You can picture a chamberlain nervously polishing goblets that will never be used again, or a scribe hiding behind a curtain, trembling as he copies urgent proclamations. Edward Vy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, moves swiftly between grief and political calculation, ensuring that her children are protected as far as possible within a court full of sharks wearing the masks of civility. Quirky fact: some reports indicate that she attempted to bribe minor officials with jewelry to secure safe passage for her sons, a maternal maneuver that may have saved or doomed them, depending on which historian you ask. Outside the chambers, the streets of London become a theater of anxiety. Merchants notice a sudden hush among the city watch, whispers of the king's death spreading from tavern to marketplace. You can almost smell the bread baking in the ovens and the smoke from chimneys mingling with the apprehension in the air. Children pause mid-play, and street performers falter in their acts, aware that something monumental has shifted. In a kingdom where rumors travel faster than royal decrees, every passerby becomes an unwitting participant in a historical drama that is just beginning to unfold. The royal council convenes immediately, a tense assembly of dukes, earls, and bishops. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, sits with a careful expression, fingers steepled, eyes scanning the room. He has long been known for his cunning and ruthlessness, yet he also presents a facade of dutiful loyalty. You can almost sense the silent calculations running through his mind. Alliances to forge, threats to neutralize, and a path to power that could be swept away in a single misstep. Mainstream accounts present him as both loyal uncle and ambitious schemer, a duality that has fascinated historians for centuries. The princes themselves are shielded as much as possible from the immediate chaos, though it is impossible to completely hide the shift in atmosphere. Tutors whisper hurried reassurances, servants adjust routines, and the boys sense, in subtle ways, that the world they knew has changed. They might notice that the laughter in corridors is quieter, that guards linger longer in doorways, and that their mother's eyes carry a weight heavier than grief alone. Quirky detail: one chronicler claims that Edward V began to sleep with a small wooden carving of a knight under his pillow, seeking protection against the invisible threats that crowded around him. Historians still argue whether the boys understood the implications of their father's death at this stage, or whether they remained children in a court that now revolves around them as political chess pieces. You, imagining the tension in those chambers, can almost feel the air thick with expectation, with fear, and with a latent sense of danger. Every whisper, every glance, every carefully measured gesture has consequences. The suddenness of the king's death also exposes the fragility of medieval succession. Edward IV had left no explicit plan for a regency, relying instead on a network of loyal nobles whose allegiances were anything but certain. You can almost hear the rustle of papers, the faint scratching of quills as proclamations are hurriedly written, and the soft gasp of courtiers, realizing that their positions, and perhaps lives, might hinge on how they navigate the next few hours. It's a vivid reminder that in this world, youth and innocence offer no shield against ambition, power, or history itself. And so, the stage is set. Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, are no longer merely princes at play. They are symbols, pawns, and potential heirs in a deadly game they are too young to fully comprehend. The court spins around them like a wheel of fortune, one that can crush as easily as it can elevate. The Tower of London, looming as both fortress and prison, awaits, ready to become the backdrop of a mystery that will echo for centuries. You can feel it in the damp chill of stone corridors, in the flicker of torchlight, and in the quiet, wary gaze of those who now circle the young heirs like predators beneath the crown's shadow. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stands apart from the court's bustle, a figure carved in shadow and intent. You can almost see him pacing in the dim corridors of the palace, the soles of his boots whispering against the stone floor, each step measured, deliberate, as if calculating both present moves and future consequences. His eyes, sharp and dark, sweep over the courtiers with a mixture of disdain and quiet amusement. He is, by most contemporary accounts, a man of intelligence and ruthless ambition, yet he maintains a veneer of loyalty and decorum that fools many. Historians still argue whether Richard's later reputation as a villain was earned through the ruthless pursuit of power, or whether it was magnified and distorted by Tudor propaganda. At 31, Richard is old enough to be considered wise, young enough to maneuver quickly, and keenly aware of his position as the youngest brother of a king now gone. You can almost feel the pulse of his mind, racing through every potential alliance, every potential threat, and every opportunity to elevate his status. He observes the royal household, noting which servants are loyal to the queen, which knights may be swayed, and which counselors carry grudges too dangerous to ignore. Quirky detail. Some chroniclers claim that Richard had a fascination with the occult and astrology, consulting star charts to determine the most auspicious moments to act. A peculiarly medieval combination of superstition and strategy. The sudden death of Edward IV places the young Edward V in Richard's care, officially as protector of the realm. The title, ceremonial yet powerful, grants him control over both the princes and the machinery of government. You can almost see the courtiers curtsying and bowing, their polite smiles masking unease, as Richard assumes a role that consolidates both authority and surveillance. He is careful, calculating. Every public gesture is measured for its appearance of loyalty. Mainstream historians note that Richard's first moves were surprisingly measured. He oversaw the prince's move to the tower with ceremonial respect and ensured that the court continued functioning smoothly. Yet behind the ceremony lies a tense undercurrent. Richard is aware that others covet the crown, or at least the influence it brings. The Woodvilles, the Queen's family, are ambitious and vocal. Nobles with grudges and claims watch from the shadows. You can almost sense Richard's mind mapping the network of threats, plotting which alliances to secure and which enemies to neutralize quietly. Quirky fact: a chronicler suggests that Richard sometimes tested his allies' loyalty by leaving them with deliberately incomplete instructions, observing who succeeded and who failed. A psychological chess game long before modern management techniques existed. Richard's personality is complex, a mix of discipline, shrewdness, and social cunning. He's known for his martial prowess, his attention to detail, and a meticulous sense of justice, at least when it serves his ends. The prince's tutors and attendants begin to notice that Richard's presence in the household shifts the atmosphere subtly. The boys sense authority tempered by a shadow of unpredictability. You can almost imagine the young Edward V watching his uncle's every movement, small hands clutching the hem of a robe, trying to decipher whether Richard is a protector or a threat. Historians still argue whether the boys perceived danger or simply respected a figure whose power was unquestioned. Outside the chambers, the city continues its rhythm, oblivious to the subtle maneuvers of its rulers. Merchants hawk spices, bread, and cloth, while children chase hoops through narrow streets. You can almost feel the contrast, the lively pulse of London versus the controlled, tense world inside the palace. Richard understands both worlds and knows that perception is key. Maintaining an image of stability ensures that no one questions his motives too loudly, even as he tightens the web around the young heirs. Within the tower itself, Richard's influence becomes tangible. Guards are reassigned, access points monitored, and attendants subtly encouraged to report unusual behavior. The princes, largely unaware of these machinations, notice only the heightened scrutiny and the weight of responsibility that seems to press upon Edward's small shoulders. Quirky detail: some accounts claim that Richard arranged the prince's quarters with particular attention to light and security, ensuring that windows faced inward rather than outward, supposedly for their protection, but it also conveniently limited their view of the outside world, keeping them under careful observation. Richard's careful balance of appearances and power plays creates a tension felt by everyone around him. Courtiers tread lightly, aware that missteps may be noted, judged, or reported. The atmosphere in the palace is thick with subtle cues: a sideways glance, a deliberate pause before a bow, the placement of a hand on a ledger or a chair. You, imagining the scene, can almost hear the whisper of silk against stone, the soft jangle of keys, and the quiet breath of men and women navigating a dangerous court. Historians still argue whether Richard's actions in these months are motivated by pure ambition, genuine concern for the young king, or a mixture of both. The complexity of his character, intelligent, careful, ruthless, and observant, makes it impossible to separate human intention from the political necessities of the time. You, imagining the corridors of Westminster and the Tower, feel the subtle tension in the air, the quiet calculations being made, and the sense that the boy's fate is already being shaped by forces beyond their comprehension. By the time Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, are finally moved to the Tower, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, has already secured his place in the machinery of power. He walks with the confidence of a man who knows the rules, bends them subtly, and understands the shadows where history itself often hides its most consequential deeds. Quirky fact: some later stories even describe Richard as having a studious melancholy, a habit of pacing at night under torchlight while muttering lines of poetry, either a mask for deep plodding or a genuine reflection of his inner world. In these months, the young prince's lives are tightly bound to Richard's careful design. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the sense that even small gestures, laughing too loudly, asking too many questions, might be interpreted and remembered. Every corridor, every chamber, every whispered instruction carries a weight that would be unimaginable to any child. And yet, beneath the tension, life continues. Servants whisper, pages run errands, and the city hums beyond the stone walls. Within this controlled chaos, Richard shapes the environment, balancing fear, loyalty, and image, all while history watches silently from the shadows. The day begins gray and cool, a mist curling along the banks of the Thames as the procession prepares to escort Edward V and his younger brother Richard to the Tower of London. You can almost feel the chill seeping through your cloak, the damp fog clinging to every inch of your skin, carrying the faint tang of river water and smoke from countless hearts along the city's streets. Horses stamp nervously, their hooves clanging against cobblestones that have borne centuries of royal processions, executions, and whispered plots. The princes, small figures in rich silks, look fragile amid the ceremonial grandeur, their wide eyes scanning the faces of guards and attendants. You probably won't survive imagining their unease without a shiver. The journey is both public and private, a strange juxtaposition of spectacle and confinement. Crowds line the streets, murmuring and bowing, some in awe, some in suspicion. Merchants lean out of windows, hawking wares in tones that seem almost hushed, as if aware of the gravity of the moment. Mainstream historians note that the route to the tower was intentionally slow, designed to display the princes to the populace, while emphasizing the solemnity of the transfer of power. Quirky detail: one chronicler described a group of London apprentices releasing doves as the procession passed, hoping to guide the young king's spirit safely, which, if nothing else, must have confused the guards and startled a few horses. You can almost hear the rustle of banners overhead, the clatter of armor, the muted tones of trumpets announcing the royal passage. Courtiers adjust cloaks, bow repeatedly, and murmur prayers, while the princes cling instinctively to each other's presence. Edward V, with his small, deliberate movements, tries to maintain dignity. Richard, Duke of York, fidgets at the hem of his tunic, eyes darting to the familiar streets. They will no longer roam freely. Historians still argue whether the boys understood the full weight of this journey, or if they perceived it as merely another royal duty, a strange parade they must endure. The route itself is lined with reminders of power and danger. Tower Hill looms ahead, a sight long associated with executions and proclamations. The scaffold, a silent warning of what history demands from those in or near the throne. You can almost feel the sense of foreboding building. The stone walls seeming to press inward as the procession approaches. Shadows of the past stretching long across the cobblestones. Guards tighten their formations, ensuring no accidental contact between the princes and the crowd. And the young heirs are led by seasoned attendants who have seen both triumph and tragedy within these streets. Inside the tower gates, the air changes. The smells shift from the lively scent of the city, fresh bread, roasting meats, river water, to the heavier, colder aromas of stone, iron, and faint mildew. The massive wooden doors, bound in iron, swing slowly to allow passage, groaning under their weight, as if protesting the arrival of the royal children. You can almost hear the soft echo of footsteps against flagstones, the faint creak of hinges, and the whisper of torches sputtering against walls. The tower is a fortress, a prison, and a palace all at once. And in that instant, the boy's world narrows to stone corridors and guarded chambers. Edward V and Richard are shown to their quarters, a blend of comfort and surveillance. Rich tapestries hang on walls to block drafts, but every corner is watched, every window a potential point of observation. Mainstream accounts emphasize that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, orchestrated this move with meticulous care, presenting it as a protective measure for his nephews, yet consolidating his own control over the young king. Quirky fact: one chronicler claimed that Richard arranged the prince's rooms so that a mirror in each chamber reflected the guards' positions, an odd combination of security and psychological oversight designed to keep the boys aware that they were never truly unobserved. The journey itself, though short in miles, is long in effect. You can almost feel the weight of each step, the tension in the air, thick enough to taste, the silent questions spinning in the boys' minds. Will they ever walk these streets again, freely? Will their parents' protection extend beyond stone walls and ceremonial processions? Historians still argue whether the ceremonial pomp was intended purely to honor the young king, or whether it subtly reinforced the control Richard was gaining over them. Outside, London continues to pulse. Merchants resume their routines, apprentices scamper through alleys, and the hum of city life carries on, indifferent to the small, monumental drama unfolding within the tower walls. You, imagining the moment, can almost smell the dampness of the stone corridors, mixing with the lingering fog of the Thames. hear the echo of the prince's careful steps, and sense the shadows moving along walls, silent witnesses to a story centuries in the making. As night falls and torches are lit, the tower seems to breathe around them. Every creaking floorboard, every flickering shadow, every distant clang of the guards' keys marks the beginning of a new chapter, one that will resonate through history, speculation, and legend. The prince's journey has ended, but their story, full of peril, innocence, and human ambition, has only just begun. Once the heavy doors of the Tower of London close behind them, Edward V and his younger brother Richard are plunged into a world both familiar and strange. You can almost hear the reverberation of their footsteps across cold flagstones, the echo bouncing off stone walls that have witnessed centuries of plotting, imprisonment, and occasional grim entertainment. The air smells faintly of damp stone, melted wax, and wood smoke from torches that line the narrow corridors. Even at night, the fortress hums with quiet activity, guards pacing, keys jingling, and the occasional murmur of a servant moving unseen. You probably won't survive imagining the claustrophobic chill. Without a shiver, life inside the tower is regimented. The boys rise at dawn to the measured rhythm of a household that blends palace protocol with the strict oversight of a fortress. Servants deliver water for washing in metal basins. Breakfast of bread and pottage arrives at precisely the same time each morning. And tutors guide Edward through Latin, arithmetic, and the art of governance, while Richard learns the decorum expected of a duke's heir. Mainstream historians note that these children received careful education, yet it was always overshadowed by the tension of their precarious political position. Quirky detail: a chronicler later claimed Edward kept a small wooden hobby horse in his quarters, trotting it along the floor as he practiced battle maneuvers, while imagining himself leading an army, an innocent pastime in a very uninnocent environment. The tower is both prison and palace. Their chambers are lined with tapestries meant to insulate against the cold, yet every wall conceals a watchful eye. Guards patrol in strict patterns, and attendants whisper with each other, passing news or gossip. Some loyal, others subtly calculating. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the awareness that every glance or word could carry consequences, even if unspoken. Historians still argue whether the princes sensed the danger surrounding them, or whether they were shielded, at least psychologically, from the full gravity of their situation. Meals in the tower are formal, yet strangely muted. The clatter of knives and plates is softened by thick tapestries, and the aroma of roasted meats and warm bread is tinged with a faint tang of stone and smoke. The boys eat in the presence of attendants, under the careful gaze of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whose expression remains unreadable. Quirky fact: one chronicler reported that Edward would often eat with one hand, leaving the other tucked under his chin, as if unconsciously shielding himself from the weight of observation. Small gestures of caution that hint at his growing awareness of the world's dangers. Time in a tower is measured not just in hours, but in ritual and observation. The princes practice reading and writing, receive visitors under strict supervision, and occasionally hear the clang of the outer gates as prisoners are moved or guards make their rounds. You can almost hear the soft murmur of Latin lessons echoing along the stone corridors, mixed with the distant clatter of armor or the squeak of leather soles. The walls themselves seem alive with history, whispering stories of those who came before, of conspiracies, escapes, and sudden ends. Despite the formal structure, moments of childhood remain. Richard fidgets, plays with small toys, or chases a stray rat down the corridor, his laughter muffled by stone walls. Edward occasionally joins him, though more cautiously, turning lessons into games of strategy or counting exercises into pretend court intrigues. Mainstream accounts describe these interactions as fleeting windows of innocence, fragile against the heavy atmosphere of responsibility and surveillance. Quirky detail. Chroniclers later suggested that the princes would sometimes leave secret notes under the floorboards for each other, small messages of comfort or playful instructions, a tiny rebellion against their monitored existence. The presence of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is felt everywhere. His oversight is subtle yet omnipresent. Guards shift their patrols slightly if he approaches. Attendants move with extra care, and even the boys instinctively know that their uncle's gaze carries weight. You can almost sense his calculated attention, the way he studies reactions, measures responses, and controls the environment around the princes. Historians still argue whether this was motivated by genuine care or by an ambition that would ultimately determine the prince's fate. Outside the chambers, the tower hums with life. Horse stables clatter, the mint produces coins, and the occasional prisoner's cry drifts through narrow corridors. Yet within the prince's quarters, the world is narrowed, a bubble of ritual, lessons, and observation. You can almost smell the faint musk of woolen clothing, the soot from torches, and the damp stone that forms a constant, inescapable backdrop to every small activity. Each day is both ordinary and laden with tension, an unusual mixture of safety and captivity that only a palace fortress can provide. As days pass, the boys adapt to routines, yet remain sensitive to subtle shifts. A guard's glance held too long, a door opened slightly ajar, or an unusual whisper can stir unease. Edward's education continues under watchful eyes. Richard observes and imitates, both learning lessons of diplomacy, strategy, and caution under circumstances they barely comprehend. Quirky fact. Some chroniclers suggest the boys occasionally press their faces against the small windows, peering down at London streets, trying to feel a connection to a world that seems simultaneously near and impossibly distant. The tower is a place of paradoxes, a home and a cage, a classroom and a courtroom, a nursery and a hall of power. You can almost hear the soft creak of floorboards, the distant jangling of keys, and the echo of footsteps that are both protective and watchful. Historians still argue whether the prince's limited freedom was designed purely for protection, or as a subtle assertion of control over their futures. And as you imagine the dim corridors, the flickering torchlight, and the quiet murmur of the young princess learning, playing, and observing, you begin to sense the slow tightening of history's grip, a narrative in motion, silently shaping two lives that would vanish from public view and echo through centuries of speculation. The corridors of the tower and the wider royal court hum with tension, a barely contained electricity that makes every footstep feel louder, every whispered word heavier. You can almost hear the rustle of silk, the quiet scrape of shoes on stone, and the low murmur of attendants exchanging news that could decide lives. In the months following Edward IV's death, the court becomes a crucible of ambition and suspicion, where every gesture, bow, and glance is scrutinized. You probably won't survive imagining the paranoia without a little shiver creeping down your spine. Courtiers jostle subtly for influence over the young Edward V and the impressionable Richard, Duke of York. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, remains outwardly calm, yet his careful attention to the princes and the arrangement of the tower's household reveals a mind plotting multiple moves ahead. Mainstream historians note that the Duke's position as protector of the realm gives him authority over not only the boys, but also the administration, the treasury, and the royal household, a combination that makes him uniquely powerful. Quirky detail: some chroniclers claim Richard used specially trained birds, messenger pigeons, perhaps more ornamental than practical, to test the loyalty of certain servants, sending small notes and watching who retrieved them promptly and accurately. Meanwhile, the Woodvilles, Elizabeth Woodville's family, maneuver to secure influence. Her brother Anthony and other close relatives push to control access to the princess, offering gifts, favors, and flattery to those around the tower. You can almost see whispered confrontations in side corridors, the flicker of torchlight revealing shadows of anger or amusement as ambitious families measure each other's intentions. Historians still argue whether the Woodvilles' assertiveness accelerated the unfolding drama, or if it merely provided Richard with an excuse to consolidate power. In the tower itself, life is tense but meticulously ordered. Edward and Richard live in an environment designed to educate yet control, where lessons in Latin, manners, and history are punctuated by the ever-present watch of guards. You can almost hear the faint tapping of quills against parchment as tutors prepare lessons, the soft murmur of Latin phrases, and the occasional rustle of a curtain revealing a shadowed figure, an attendant, or perhaps a spy. No one can be sure. Quirky fact: some chroniclers describe the prince's rooms as being furnished with mirrors, positioned at odd angles so that every corner of the chamber could be observed without moving a guard, creating a psychological sense of omnipresence. Beyond the immediate household, political intrigue seeps into every corner of court life. Nobles whisper in private chambers, plotting marriages, alliances, and betrayals. You can almost feel the weight of their scheming, the tension palpable in the air, as though the walls themselves absorb every secret. Richard III's reputation as cautious, calculating, and often ruthless grows. Yet he projects an image of care and duty, a duality that fascinates historians. Mainstream accounts suggest that he moved deliberately to appear the protector of his nephews, even as he tightened his control over the levers of power. The princes themselves are sensitive to these tensions, even if they do not fully comprehend them. Edward, more reserved, watches his uncle and the household with a quiet vigilance, while Richard, younger and more observant in some ways, notes subtleties in the behavior of servants and guards. You can almost feel the mental exercises of these children, learning not just lessons from tutors, but the unspoken rules of power, hierarchy, and survival. Historians still argue whether these early experiences shaped their fates or simply left them unprepared for the darker turns ahead. Rumors circulate like wildfire. Whispers of a possible usurper, strange accidents, or sudden illnesses keep the court on edge. You can almost hear the soft exclamations of surprise, the furtive glances exchanged behind fans or curtains, and the hurried scrawl of notes to be passed discreetly along corridors. Quirky detail. One account mentions that some nobles tried to read the prince's faces for signs of fear or defiance, as if the children themselves could reveal plots with a single glance. Every interaction is a performance. Servants bow with precision, attendants smile while measuring intentions, and the princes are subtly trained to behave as symbols of authority while simultaneously being observed for weakness. You can almost feel the invisible threads connecting each actor in this drama, a web of loyalty, fear, and ambition that tightens with every passing day. Historians still argue whether Richard's strategy was brilliant statecraft, cold manipulation, or a mix of both. Even ordinary events take on a heightened sense of importance. A delivered letter could shift alliances. A misplaced gift might signal disrespect, and a casual conversation could carry unintended consequences. You can almost hear the quiet shuffle of documents, the careful folding of notes, and the soft echo of words in hallways that have seen more treachery than any classroom lesson could prepare a child to understand. By the end of these months, the court has transformed into a living chessboard. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moves pieces with deliberate calculation. The young princes watched at every turn, the Woodvilles pressing from the edges, and ambitious courtiers testing each other's loyalty. You, imagining the scene, feel the tension, the layered strategies, and the subtle games of observation that define life inside the tower. Each day, the stakes grow higher, and every smile, every bow, every whispered suggestion carries the potential to tip fate in unexpected ways. The court is unusually hushed in the weeks following Edward IV's death, a silence punctuated only by the shuffle of feet on stone floors and the occasional distant clang of armored guards. You can almost feel the tension in the air, a thick, almost tangible pressure that presses down on everyone within Westminster and the Tower. The young Edward V should be crowned, should be taking his place formally as king, yet the coronation is suspended, delayed indefinitely. You probably won't survive imagining the anxiety of two boys on the cusp of absolute power, while the adults around them maneuver like predators. The suspension is not simply ceremonial. It carries weighty political implications. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, presents the delay as a matter of caution, citing Edward VI's youth and the need for proper preparation. Mainstream historians note that delaying the coronation gives Richard considerable leverage. As protector, he retains de facto control over government and the royal household, ensuring that decisions continue to flow through his hands. Quirky detail. Chroniclers recount that some courtiers whispered rumors the delay was because Edward V refused to part with his favorite wooden toys, insisting he could not be crowned until he had finished a war campaign with miniature soldiers. A charming, if likely exaggerated, image of childhood stubbornness in the midst of high politics. Outside the tower, the citizens of London murmur among themselves. Merchants discuss the implications, apprentices speculate, and the wider nobility notices the unusual hiatus. You can almost hear the murmur of voices, mixing with the creak of cartwheels and the distant clang of church bells, echoing the uncertainty gripping the city. Historians still argue whether the delay was purely for political prudence or whether it was a calculated move to pave the way for Richard's eventual ascension. Inside the tower, the prince's routine continues under strict supervision. Guards patrol more frequently, attendants whisper more carefully, and tutors maintain lessons with a heightened sense of urgency. You can almost see Edward V at his desk, quill in hand, brow furrowed in concentration as he copies Latin texts, while Richard, younger and more restless, fidgets with a small wooden soldier, practicing maneuvers in imitation of his brother. The juxtaposition is striking. Two children, one bearing the burden of future kingship, the other learning the rules of the court, both under constant observation. Meanwhile, the political chessboard outside their chambers grows increasingly complex. The Woodvilles push to maintain influence over the princes, lobbying the council and arranging alliances with sympathetic nobles. You can almost hear the hushed consultations behind tapestries, the faint rustle of parchment, as proclamations are drafted and unsigned decrees await approval. Quirky fact. Some accounts suggest that Richard conducted nightly walks along the tower's ramparts, reading omens in the stars and consulting astrologers, blending superstition with strategy to assert psychological dominance over his young nephews. Every day without a coronation is a day of growing tension. The princes feel it instinctively, a quiet knowledge that the world has shifted. Edward, more reserved, contemplates the weight of expectation, while Richard notices subtle changes in the behavior of those around him. The careful deferments, the quick curtsies, the guarded expressions. You can almost sense their awareness of being watched, measured, and studied, as if the walls themselves record every gesture and glance. Historians still argue whether Edward V and his brother fully grasped the political machinations surrounding them, or whether they remained children in a dangerous adult world. The delay also affects the morale and behavior of the household. Guards become stricter, servants whisper more cautiously, and the sense of ritual that once marked daily life shifts toward a muted vigilance. You can almost feel the invisible tension threading through the stone corridors. The flicker of torchlight casting elongated shadows that seem to follow the prince's every step. Quirky detail. A chronicler suggested that Edward would sometimes leave notes hidden under floorboards, small instructions or questions for his brother, creating a secret correspondence that was perhaps his way of exerting tiny control over his constrained environment. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, maintains outward composure, a master of appearances. He meets with counselors, handles petitions, and ensures that the machinery of government continues to operate smoothly, all while keeping the young princes close and under careful observation. You can almost sense the layers of calculation in his every gesture, from the tilt of a head to the measured pacing of his steps. Historians still argue whether Richard's patience was a mark of prudence or a prelude to a more audacious plan. A question that has fueled centuries of speculation. Even simple events take on weight. Meals are watched, letters are read, visitors are scrutinized. You can almost hear the faint click of keys as doors are locked, the soft echo of footsteps in the halls, the barely perceptible exchange of glances among attendants. Life in the tower is both ordinary and extraordinary, a blend of routine and subtle tension, where the delay of a coronation becomes a pivot around which power, ambition, and childhood hang in fragile balance. By the end of this suspended period, the tower is no longer merely a fortress or a royal residence. It is a crucible. The young princes, confined yet observed, grow ever more aware of the invisible threads of control. The adults around them continue to maneuver. The city watches with anxious curiosity, and history waits patiently, recording each whispered word and each calculated step. You, imagining the scene, feel the quiet, suffocating weight of expectation and the ever-present shadow of ambition. The coronation suspension is more than a delay. It is the beginning of a story that will leave the world asking questions for centuries. The morning begins like any other, with the low murmur of guards and the faint smell of damp stone and burning torches curling through the tower corridors. You can almost hear the subtle clatter of keys, the soft rustle of silk, and the footsteps of attendants moving between chambers, all oblivious to the moment that will soon unsettle the kingdom. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, are expected to rise and continue their lessons. Yet a strange tension hangs heavier than usual in the air. You probably won't survive imagining the sudden, inexplicable stillness that follows their disappearance without a chill running down your spine. One day, the boys simply vanish from their quarters. Guards report nothing unusual, no open windows, no sign of escape, no disturbance. But when attendants check the rooms, the princes are gone. Mainstream historical records note that Edward and Richard were last seen playing quietly under the watchful eye of their tutors and the protective presence of Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Yet when the moment comes for breakfast, they are nowhere to be found. Quirky detail. Chroniclers later claimed that the princes had once attempted to hide in large trunks during a game, and some speculated that perhaps they had learned the art of concealment too well. Though the idea is more fanciful than practical, the tower erupts in hushed panic. You can almost feel the tension vibrating through the stone walls. The guards' hurried footsteps echoing as they search corridor after corridor, the distant clanging of gates as knights and officials rush to investigate. Courtiers whisper furiously, exchanging theories ranging from ordinary misadventure to the more terrifying possibility of foul play. Historians still argue whether the disappearance was the result of deliberate action by those in power or a tragic, accidental confinement that spiraled out of control. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, presents an outwardly calm demeanor, yet those closest to him notice subtle signs of agitation. You can almost see his eyes scanning each guard, measuring reactions, adjusting his posture to project authority, and perhaps masking worry or calculation. He convenes meetings with counselors, reassures the Woodvilles in carefully chosen words, and asserts control over the search while carefully controlling the narrative. Quirky fact: one account mentions that he ordered specially trained hounds to comb the inner wards of the tower, a task more theatrical than effective, signaling both diligence and psychological pressure on the household. Meanwhile, rumors begin to spread beyond the tower. Citizens of London speculate wildly, imagining secret escapes, hidden murders, or divine retribution. Merchants murmur at market stalls, apprentices exchange whispered theories in alleyways, and even visiting dignitaries grow uneasy, noting the sudden shift in atmosphere. You can almost hear the ripple of uncertainty traveling from cobblestone streets to council chambers, a city collectively holding its breath. Inside the tower, attendants, guards, and tutors recount their last interactions with the princes, each subtle discrepancy magnified in significance. Edward had asked questions about distant lands. Richard had been unusually curious about keys and locks, small details that now take on ominous significance. Historians still argue whether these behaviors suggest that the boys anticipated danger or were simply the playful curiosity of children trapped in an adult world. The lack of visibility of the princes casts a long shadow. You can almost feel the chill of empty rooms, the faint scent of unplayed with toys, and the echoes of absent laughter filling the stone corridors. Guards shift positions nervously, while courtiers tread carefully, aware that the absence of the heirs alters every social and political dynamic. Quirky detail: some chroniclers claimed that Edward had a small carved figurine of a knight that he always carried, and when it was found left behind, it was interpreted as a sign that the princes had been taken, intentionally or otherwise, a talisman abandoned in a moment of crisis. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, begins to consolidate further control. Publicly, he maintains a facade of concern and protection, yet private actions reveal an increasing grip over the tower and the kingdom. You can almost sense the invisible threads he pulls, reassigning guards, controlling communication, and subtly limiting the influence of the Woodvilles and other nobles. Historians still argue whether his actions at this stage were preventive measures, strategic genius, or the first moves in a plan that would ultimately make him king. The city and the court are left with a mystery that quickly becomes legend. No confirmed sightings of the princes emerge, and no credible evidence explains their disappearance. You can almost hear the quiet dread settling over London, the soft whispers growing louder with each passing day. The heavy expectation that something irreparable has occurred. The tower itself seems to hold its breath, the stone walls absorbing every secret, every fear, every anxious thought of those who inhabit it. The sudden vanishing of Edward of Fevré and Richard, Duke of York, marks the beginning of a historical puzzle that will grip generations. You, imagining the scene, feel the tension in the air, the silent panic, and the sense that a fate once simple and predictable has transformed into a labyrinth of uncertainty, speculation, and enduring mystery. In the shadows of the tower, innocence meets ambition, and history begins to whisper a story that may never be fully revealed. Once the news of the prince's disappearance begins to seep beyond the tower walls, rumors take flight like startled pigeons, scattering in every direction and settling into the corners of London's bustling streets. You can almost hear the whispers, carried from tavern to market, from merchant to apprentice, each retelling adding a layer of speculation, embellishment, or outright invention. You probably won't survive imagining the swirl of panic, fascination, and gossip without feeling the pulse of collective anxiety gripping the city. By mid-morning, rumors reach every social layer. Merchants speak quietly behind stall counters. Apprentices pause in their games to speculate, and even clergy murmur to each other in corridors, their eyes darting as though the act of whispering might summon the unseen danger closer. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize that the sudden vanishing of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, sparked widespread fear and political anxiety, undermining confidence in the stability of the monarchy. Quirky detail. One chronicler claimed that a street performer dressed as a king appeared in the marketplace, mimicking the prince's disappearance and asking coins for his magical vanishing act, which amused some townsfolk and enraged others who thought it ill-omened. In court, the gossip is more pointed, sharper, and tinged with fear. Nobles trade theories in whispered corridors. Some insist the princes were spirited away for their protection. Others suspect foul play orchestrated by ambitious men hungry for the crown. You can almost hear the soft clinking of goblets in private rooms as courtiers raise eyebrows and exchange quiet, urgent speculation. Historians still argue whether these rumors reflected genuine concern for the boys or served as convenient cover for political maneuvering. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moves with measured calm, outwardly projecting concern while subtly manipulating the flow of information. You can almost sense him listening at doors, observing reactions, and deciding which versions of events to allow and which to suppress. Quirky fact: some chroniclers suggest he occasionally staged minor sightings of the princes, having servants whisper that the boys had been spotted in certain rooms, creating both reassurance and controlled ambiguity, a psychological masterstroke that would keep fear and curiosity in equal balance. The general populace is enthralled. Children gather at corners, repeating stories told by older siblings, embellishing them with imaginary dungeons, secret tunnels, or heroic rescues. Adults speculate with the same mix of horror and fascination, debating whether the princes had vanished by magic, by accident, or by dark human design. You can almost hear the cadence of these street tales. Half fear, half amusement, half moral lesson, taking on a life of their own, far from the tower. Courtiers, meanwhile, act with caution. Letters are drafted and dispatched, rumors quietly countered, alliances reassessed. You can almost hear the soft scratching of quills, the subtle rustle of parchment, and the careful lowering of voices as nobles weigh which whispers to take seriously and which to ignore. Mainstream historians note that this period of rumor and uncertainty strengthened Richard's grip on the court, as public and private perception increasingly aligned with the image of him as the protector of the realm. Yet even within the tower, the boy's absence is felt keenly. Guards recount the last observed moments. Servants recall conversations and odd behaviors, and every detail becomes fodder for interpretation. You can almost sense the heightened vigilance in the corridors, the subtle tightening of patrols, and the quiet psychological pressure applied to all who remain. Quirky detail. Chroniclers mention that Edward's favorite carved wooden knight was left in his chambers, and the absence of the boy alongside this toy became a symbol repeated in whispers as the king without his guard, a metaphor that fed both fear and imagination. Outside the immediate court, rumors take on political potency. Nobles begin to question allegiances, some pushing for inquiries, others silently observing to see who gains advantage. You can almost feel the tension crackle, the invisible threads of gossip and ambition intertwining to create a web that envelops not only the tower, but the city, the kingdom, and the future of the monarchy itself. Historians still argue whether these rumors were merely chaotic public speculation or a deliberate manipulation by those seeking power. The human tendency to fill gaps with story is evident everywhere. You can almost see mothers whispering cautionary tales to children, guildsmen speculating in the pubs, and messengers misreporting information to gain favor or attention. The narrative spins outward, taking on mythic qualities, layering imagination over fact, until the line between reality and legend is nearly imperceptible. Quirky fact. Some accounts claim that anonymous poems appeared in the streets, mourning the missing princes in rhymed verse, blending fear, political critique, and popular storytelling into the public consciousness. As the weeks stretch on, these rumors harden into accepted ideas. The princes are missing, perhaps hidden, perhaps harmed. The lack of transparency fuels speculation, and every retelling compounds uncertainty. You can almost hear the cumulative effect of whispers, the soft hum of anxiety threading through streets and halls alike. In this charged environment, perception becomes power, and stories take on a force nearly as real as any decree or sword. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother becomes more than a personal tragedy. It evolves into a social phenomenon, a narrative that will grip the minds of contemporaries and historians for centuries. Years later, long after the princess disappeared, whispers of hidden skeletons begin to surface, tucked away in the dim recesses of the Tower of London. You can almost smell the damp stone and faint iron tang of old chains as chroniclers recount tales of a secret chamber, a forgotten stairwell, or a neglected corner where the boys might have met their end. You probably won't survive imagining the eerie stillness of such a hidden space without a shiver crawling down your spine. The discovery is mundane on one level. Workmen or officials performing renovations or inspections stumble upon two small skeletons buried beneath the floor of what was once the royal lodgings. Mainstream historical accounts report that the bones are unmarked, simple, and disturbingly silent, raising immediate questions about identity and cause of death. Quirky detail. A rumor claims that a cat, apparently accustomed to hiding in that exact corner for decades, scurried away in terror when the bones were unearthed, as if it remembered something the humans did not. The court reacts with both horror and intrigue. You can almost hear the careful shuffling of advisors, the soft murmur of whispers, and the distant clanging of armor as news spreads. The discovery casts new light on the centuries-old mystery. Could these really be Edward V and Richard, Duke of York? Or were they unfortunate victims of another, unrelated tragedy within the tower's sprawling walls? Historians still argue whether these remains are the missing princes, or if they belonged to other children who were imprisoned and died in the tower. A question that has fueled debate for generations. Examination of the skeletons is rudimentary by modern standards. Observers note their small size, suggesting they are children, and the lack of personal belongings or distinctive markings. You can almost picture the careful, hushed handling of bones, the measured curiosity of those conducting the inspection, and the creeping sense of solemnity that descends over all present. Quirky detail. Some chroniclers later claimed that the floor where the skeletons were found felt heavier than the rest of the tower, a superstitious notion reflecting the weight of historical memory pressing down on the living. Richard III's role is re-evaluated in the light of this discovery. You can almost hear the whispered reassessments of his character: protector, villain, ambitious uncle, or tragic, miscalculating figure. Mainstream historians continue to debate whether he orchestrated the prince's disappearance, or if political propaganda in subsequent Tudor accounts unfairly vilified him. The skeleton's discovery reignites these discussions, forcing scholars to reconsider both narrative and evidence. The tower itself seems to hold its breath. Stone walls that have absorbed centuries of secrets now seem almost alive with memory. You can almost sense the echo of children's laughter, the soft steps of guards, and the rustle of tapestries as the past presses insistently against the present. Quirky detail. One chronicler describes a sudden draft sweeping through the chamber where the skeletons were found, extinguishing candles and causing papers to flutter. Interpreted at the time as a supernatural acknowledgement of the dead, public reaction is a mix of fascination and dread. Londoners gather outside the tower gates, trading stories and speculating on identity, cause of death, and the moral weight of the discovery. You can almost hear the murmurs ripple through the streets, the exchange of information, blending fact, rumor, and legend into a potent narrative that will last centuries. Historians still argue whether the public perception of the discovery has been shaped by genuine evidence or by centuries of retelling and embellishment. Attempts to identify the skeletons more definitively continue sporadically. Skeptics and supporters weigh in, proposing tests, historical cross-referencing, and even folklore comparisons. You can almost imagine the meticulous patience required, the subtle thrill of inching closer to the truth, and the lingering frustration of inconclusive results. Quirky detail. Some amateur investigators claimed that the skeletons whispered secrets if one pressed an ear to the floor. An obviously fanciful notion, yet one that captures the enduring fascination with this mystery. By the end of the investigation, certainty remains elusive. The skeletons are moved, examined, and preserved, yet their identities remain formally unconfirmed. You can almost feel the collective breath of historians, tourists, and enthusiasts alike, suspended in the tension between evidence and legend. The Tower of London continues to guard its secrets with stoic indifference, as if daring anyone to definitively solve a puzzle shaped by ambition, innocence, and centuries of narrative layering. In this moment, the missing prince's story intersects with a tangible world. Bones, stone, and shadows, linking centuries of speculation to the cold reality of mortality. You can almost hear the faint whisper of history brushing against modern ears, the subtle suggestion that some mysteries, though investigated, analyzed, and theorized, may never be fully unveiled. Historians still argue whether the discovery offers closure or simply deepens the enigma surrounding Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. As the mystery of the missing princes continues to echo through history, you can almost hear the clash of pens on parchment, the murmur of scribes, and the quiet deliberation of chroniclers, each trying to make sense of events that seem to slip through the cracks of certainty. You probably won't survive imagining the maze of conflicting tales without feeling the dizzying swirl of possibility and doubt. Different chroniclers offer sharply divergent narratives. Some portray Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as a calculating villain, a cold-blooded uncle whose ambition knew no bounds. Mainstream historians note that these accounts, often written during the Tudor era, were influenced by political motivations to legitimize Henry VII's claim to the throne. Quirky detail. One chronicler claimed that Richard would secretly practice archery at night on effigies of his nephews. A colorful, almost cinematic image that historians debate as either exaggerated slander or symbolic metaphor. Other chroniclers take a more sympathetic approach, emphasizing Richard's duty as protector of the realm and his ostensibly careful oversight of the princes. These accounts suggest that the boy's disappearance could have been the result of misfortune, illness, or mismanagement, rather than deliberate foul play. You can almost hear the soft scratching of quills as writers labor to frame a narrative that absolves or condemns, each emphasizing details that support their interpretation. Historians still argue whether these sympathetic accounts reflect reality or were carefully constructed to preserve Richard's posthumous reputation. Discrepancies abound in even the most basic details. Some reports place the princes in specific chambers on certain nights. Others suggest different locations entirely. Quirky fact: one source insists that the princes were last seen riding miniature wooden horses down the tower corridors, while another insists they were always confined to their study chambers. A charming inconsistency, highlighting how rumor, memory, and imagination intermingle in historical record-keeping. The chroniclers' narratives often reflect their own biases and audiences. Scribes connected to the Tudor court emphasize danger, villainy, and moral lessons, while those aligned with Yorkist sympathizers highlight duty, loyalty, and tragic misfortune. You can almost feel the invisible lines of allegiance stretching across pages, the subtle hand of patronage guiding what was recorded, preserved, or emphasized. Historians still argue whether the chronicler's accounts can ever be reconciled into a single coherent story, or whether the conflicting tales are themselves the truest reflection of the uncertainty surrounding the princes. Even the sequence of events differs dramatically. Some claim that Richard orchestrated the boys' confinement with immediate malice. Others suggest a gradual tightening of control, where an initial attempt at protection spiraled into tragedy. You can almost hear the debate playing out in parchment margins, in footnotes, and in whispers over centuries, as scholars wrestle with incomplete records and interpretive gaps. Quirky detail: one chronicle reports that a servant once claimed to see a shadow taller than any man pass silently through the prince's chambers, a detail that may be poetic embellishment or a reflection of the pervasive fear and unease in the tower. Beyond locations and actions, chroniclers argue over the prince's behavior. Some describe Edward V as contemplative and cautious, Richard as mischievous and restless. Others portray them as inseparable, unified in curiosity and playfulness. You can almost feel the texture of these observations: small gestures, fleeting expressions, whispered words that would seem trivial at the time, but are now magnified by centuries of speculation. Historians still argue whether these behavioral descriptions were drawn from direct observation, hearsay, or the chronicler's desire to evoke sympathy or scandal. Even the reports of the prince's disappearance vary. Some suggest they vanished quietly overnight. Others describe a dramatic removal, with doors unlocked and gates unguarded, or a scene of apparent abduction by masked figures. You can almost hear the soft gasp of courtiers in these accounts, the exaggerated tension intended to capture attention and underscore moral lessons. Quirky fact: one chronicler claimed the princes were spirited away by a mysterious fog that filled the tower one evening, a poetic flourish that blurs the line between fact and fanciful storytelling. As decades turn into centuries, historians sift through these conflicting accounts, weighing evidence, comparing narratives, and examining potential biases. You can almost feel the meticulous patience, the quiet frustration, and the thrill of discovery as they parse through handwriting, parchment, and marginalia to tease out probable truths. Historians still argue whether any single chronicler's account holds primacy, or whether the truth is an irretrievable mosaic pieced together from partial, biased, and sometimes contradictory sources. Even today, chroniclers' conflicting tales fuel fascination. You can almost hear modern readers debating over coffee in classrooms and in documentaries, dissecting motives, sequences, and interpretations driven by the enduring allure of a story that refuses to be neatly resolved. The tower's walls, in your imagination, hold these layered voices: fear, intrigue, embellishment, and reflection, echoing through centuries in every whisper, every scribbled note, every retelling. Ultimately, the tale of the missing princes is inseparable from the chroniclers who recorded it. You can almost feel the tension between narrative and fact, between imagination and evidence, between moral judgment and historical inquiry. The conflicting tales are themselves part of the mystery, a prism through which each generation examines ambition, innocence, and the precariousness of power. Historians still argue whether we will ever reconcile these stories into a coherent truth, or whether the multiplicity of voices is the closest we can come to understanding what truly happened. The news of the prince's disappearance spreads through London like wildfire, igniting a public shock and outcry that resonates far beyond the stone walls of the tower. You can almost hear the hushed murmurs swell into urgent conversations, the clatter of carts stopping mid-street as merchants pause to exchange news, and the distant tolling of church bells marking both concern and curiosity. You probably won't survive imagining the city's collective unease without feeling the prickling tension of an anxious populace. Every corner of the city becomes a forum for speculation. Street vendors pause in the midst of their calls. Apprentices stop their games, and townsfolk gather in small knots, exchanging versions of the story as though it were a living, breathing entity. Mainstream historians note that the public reaction was immediate and intense, reflecting both fear for the missing heirs and suspicion of foul play at the highest levels of government. Quirky detail: some chroniclers claim that a popular singer composed an impromptu ballad about the prince's disappearance, performing it in taverns, market squares, and even outside the tower gates. His song blending fact, rumor, and moral warning in a way that thrilled and terrified listeners. The atmosphere in court is equally charged. Nobles feel the pressure of public scrutiny, understanding that citizens' concern could translate into political leverage or unrest. You can almost hear the shuffle of papers, the low hum of whispered discussions, and the soft clinking of goblets as courtiers debate how to respond to a population that feels both helpless and angry. Historians still argue whether the intensity of public outcry influenced the decisions of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, or whether he remained largely unaffected, guided only by ambition and strategy. Within the tower, the absence of the princes is palpable. Guards feel the weight of expectation. Servants tread cautiously, and even the walls seem to hold a heightened sense of observation. You can almost sense the tension in every corridor, the quiet pressure of responsibility pressing on those tasked with maintaining order In a situation that has become politically explosive, quirky detail, chroniclers mention that Edward's favorite wooden knight, left behind in his chambers, was whispered about by visitors as if it were a silent witness to the events, an object that carried symbolic weight far beyond its humble form. Citizens demand answers, turning to clergy, merchants, and local officials in hopes of finding clarity. You can almost hear the low hum of collective anxiety as people repeat rumors, speculate wildly, and concoct theories ranging from protective concealment to murder for power. Mainstream accounts emphasize that this atmosphere of public scrutiny created immense pressure on the monarchy, forcing nobles and advisors to act more cautiously, or at least to appear as if they were acting. The Woodvilles, ever vigilant, attempt to harness public sentiment to influence the unfolding political situation. You can almost feel their whisper campaigns, their strategic conversations in shadowed corridors, their careful appeals to sympathy and justice. Historians still argue whether their efforts were effective in swaying public opinion, or if the momentum of rumor and fear had already overtaken any carefully laid plans. Even everyday activities are tinged with apprehension. Markets, guilds, and public spaces become theaters of observation, where citizens measure each other's reactions and subtly gauge the truth behind the whispers. You can almost hear merchants quietly commenting on the latest version of the story, apprentices debating possible plots, and neighbors exchanging secretive glances to signal concern or complicity. Quirky fact: one account claims that children in London began playing a morbid game called Hide the Princes, a mix of pretend rescue and imaginative speculation, reflecting how deeply the story penetrated even the youngest minds. The political reverberations of public outcry are immediate. You can almost feel the invisible pressure on Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as he navigates the fine line between authority and perception, carefully balancing appearances while consolidating power. Every public appearance, every statement, every visible action is magnified, scrutinized, and interpreted through the lens of collective anxiety. Historians still argue whether Richard's careful management of appearances was a deliberate tactic to maintain control, or merely a reaction to an uncontrollable public narrative. Rumors and public sentiment together create a volatile environment. You can almost feel the tension crackle like electricity, with every retelling adding color, embellishment, or moral overtones. The disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, transcends a private tragedy and becomes a social event, a story embedded in communal memory, influencing both behavior and belief in subtle, pervasive ways. By the end of this period, public shock and outcry have transformed the disappearance into legend. You can almost hear the echo of whispered tales threading through the streets and courts alike, a collective consciousness that shapes perception, suspicion, and interpretation. The city's reaction, layered with fear, curiosity, and moral judgment, cements the prince's vanishing as one of the most enduring mysteries of English history, where rumor and outrage intertwine to keep the story alive for centuries. As the years pass and the Tudors take the throne, the story of the missing princes becomes more than history. It transforms into legend, carefully polished and spun to suit political needs. You can almost hear the rustle of parchment, the scratch of quills, and the low hum of council chambers, where narratives are shaped to justify rule and influence perception. You probably won't survive imagining how much of what survives is more clever storytelling than a fact, without feeling a subtle chill at the manipulation of memory. Richard III, already dead by the time the Tudors ascend, becomes a central character in this retelling. Mainstream historians note that Tudor chroniclers painted him as a calculating villain, emphasizing ambition, ruthlessness, and supposed guilt in the disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. You can almost picture the scribes leaning over manuscripts by candlelight, embellishing details to make the moral lesson as clear as possible. Ambition unchecked leads to ruin. Quirky detail. One chronicler suggested that Richard's eyes burned with unnatural fire, a dramatic flourish obviously designed for theatrical effect, yet one that has lodged itself in popular imagination for centuries. The Tudor spin extends beyond characterization. Events are reordered, motivations simplified, and ambiguities erased to create a coherent narrative that strengthens Henry VII's claim to the throne. You can almost hear the careful cutting and pasting of documents, letters, and chronicles, as storytellers decide which details support legitimacy and which must be muted or omitted. Historians still argue whether these alterations were deliberate propaganda, natural simplifications of complex events, or a combination of both. In literature and public memory, the missing princes become symbols, innocent victims, embodiments of lost potential, and cautionary figures for the dangers of ambition. You can almost see them represented in plays, poems, and stories, their small figures looming large over moral lessons and political commentary. Quirky fact: one Tudor-era play depicted the princes as having magical foresight, able to foresee their uncle's treachery, a fanciful addition that reflects both creative license and the period's taste for allegory. Public perception is profoundly shaped by this reframing. Londoners and later generations internalize a narrative that presents Richard III as the clear villain, his actions both horrifying and understandable in the moral logic of storytelling. You can almost hear the whispered stories in taverns, the murmurs among apprentices, and the references in sermons, all echoing the Tudor version of events. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of this narrative distorts genuine historical understanding, or simply represents the natural evolution of collective memory. Even the treatment of evidence is colored by Tudor priorities. The skeletal remains, the tower's architecture, the documents and letters. Everything is interpreted to fit the emerging narrative of guilt and villainy. You can almost feel the tension between empirical observation and narrative convenience. The subtle tug of interpretation, bending facts toward desired conclusions. Quirky detail. Some Tudor chroniclers claimed that the floorboards creaked ominously near the prince's rooms, as if the tower itself mourned their absence. A poetic addition that illustrates the blending of superstition, morality, and political storytelling. This spin also affects Richard III's posthumous reputation. He's portrayed as the archetype of treachery, a man whose ambition led him to destroy his own nephews. You can almost feel the weight of centuries of accusation pressing down, the cumulative effect of narrative-shaping memory, and the subtle way myth overtakes reality in the public imagination. Historians still argue whether he was truly guilty or whether the Tudor spin has overshadowed evidence that might have told a more nuanced story. Within the tower, the story becomes almost allegorical. The empty chambers, the hidden corridors, and the lingering shadows of childhood are transformed into symbols of vulnerability, betrayal, and political cunning. You can almost sense the imagined footsteps of the princes echoing through stone halls, overlaid with centuries of storytelling that reshapes every creak, every draft, every locked door. Even modern interpretations, whether in textbooks, documentaries, or historical novels, trace back to this Tudor framing. You can almost hear the echo of Tudor pens, guiding modern understanding, shaping expectations, and coloring every retelling with a narrative lens that favors drama over ambiguity. Quirky fact: some modern guides still reproduce Tudor-era illustrations, showing Richard III with a hooked nose and menacing posture, a physical exaggeration invented to reinforce character judgment rather than reflect reality. By the end of this reinterpretation, history has been deliberately shaped to serve politics, storytelling, and moral instruction. You can almost feel the weight of centuries of perspective pressing on the bare facts. A reminder that historical memory is as much about who tells the story as what actually happened. Historians still argue whether the Tudor spin can ever be fully disentangled from the original events, or whether the story of Edward Theft and Richard, Duke of York, will forever exist in a blend of fact, legend, and political artifice. Once the Tudor spin takes hold, conspiracies multiply like shadows at twilight, stretching across the city, the court, and eventually the imagination of generations. You can almost feel the threads of suspicion tangling together, whispering through the corridors of power, clinking across cobblestone streets, and treading into the minds of every citizen who dares to wonder what really happened. You probably won't survive imagining the dizzying web of intrigue without feeling your skin crawl with anticipation. From the moment the princes vanish, theories emerge. Some claim that Richard III orchestrated their disappearance with cold calculation. Others suggest that Henry Tudor, or agents loyal to him, might have been complicit in some subtle, long-term plan. Mainstream historians note that speculation was heightened by the lack of transparency and the tower's notorious reputation as a place where secrets, both political and deadly, could be hidden. Quirky detail: one fringe account proposes that a secret tunnel beneath the tower was used to spirit the boys away, an idea so elaborate that even contemporary skeptics laughed. Yet it persists in popular imagination. The court becomes a hotbed of rumor and suspicion. You can almost hear whispered conversations in candlelit corridors, the shuffle of nobles' feet on stone floors as alliances are weighed, and the barely audible clink of goblets signaling a hush before delicate gossip. Nobles speculate about loyalties, betrayals, and hidden motives, aware that a single word could shift power or reputation dramatically. Historians still argue whether these rumors reflected genuine knowledge or were simply a mechanism for nobles to navigate a politically fraught environment. Outside the tower, London is alive with conjecture. Merchants and apprentices pass theories like coins, embellishing each retelling. You can almost hear the market square vibrating with speculation that the princes were murdered, that they had escaped secretly to France, or that a powerful noble kept them hidden to leverage the throne. Quirky fact: some sources claim that fortune tellers in the streets offered predictions about the prince's fate, charging small coins to anxious citizens, hoping for divine insight, blending superstition and social anxiety into the conspiracy mill. In the broader political landscape, conspiracies also serve strategic purposes. You can almost sense nobles subtly planting rumors to test loyalty, intimidate rivals, or shape public perception. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, outwardly projecting calm and rational authority, also manipulates narrative, allowing some whispers while suppressing others, carefully curating his image as protector. Historians still argue whether his control of information was purely defensive or part of a proactive plan to secure power. Stories of the prince's fate evolved dramatically over time. Some claim they were hidden alive for years. Others assert they were quietly eliminated, their deaths never witnessed. You can almost see the mental gymnastics of chroniclers trying to reconcile gaps in the record with political necessity, imagination, and personal bias. Quirky detail: one chronicler described a mysterious figure wandering near the tower at night, believed by some townsfolk to be a ghostly prince. An anecdote blending grief, fear, and theatricality in a single narrative flourish. Even in absence, the prince's symbolic weight grows. You can almost feel the intensity of their unseen presence in council meetings, in speeches, and in the quiet judgment of citizens, as if their disappearance casts a shadow that bends reality around it. Historians still argue whether these symbolic uses of the missing princes were deliberate or simply a natural psychological response to uncertainty and power vacuum. As conspiracies multiply, every detail is reinterpreted. A misplaced key, a hurriedly closed door, or a whispered suggestion becomes potential evidence in countless competing narratives. You can almost hear the echoes of interpretation ricocheting through the tower and the city alike, turning even mundane events into potential plot points in a grand drama. Quirky fact: one rumor suggested that the princes were disguised as pages and sent to live anonymously in noble households. A fanciful theory that continues to capture imaginations in books, plays, and documentaries. The multiplicity of conspiracies cements the story's enduring mystery. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the nervous energy of citizens and courtiers alike, and the persistent hum of unanswered questions. Each retelling, each whispered hypothesis, and each documented rumor intertwines with history, legend, and fear, creating a narrative that refuses simple closure. By the end of this period, the vanished princes are more than historical figures. They are catalysts for suspicion, symbols of power struggles, and anchors for imagination. You can almost hear centuries of debate, storytelling, and speculation vibrating through the tower walls, reminding every visitor and historian alike that absence can wield influence as profoundly as presence. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of conspiracies has clarified the truth or merely obscured it further, leaving the mystery of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, as tantalizing as ever. The question that haunts every historian, novelist, and curious mind is simple yet impossibly complex. What exactly happened to Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York? You can almost feel the weight of the tower pressing down on the imagination, the cold stone and faint iron scent mixing with centuries of speculation. You probably won't survive imagining the multitude of fates suggested for these young boys without feeling the tension knotting in your chest. Mainstream accounts offer several grim possibilities. One theory posits that the princes were quietly murdered within the tower, their lives extinguished by ambition and political expediency. Another suggests that they might have died from illness or neglect, trapped in an environment increasingly hostile to their survival. Historians still argue whether their disappearance was a calculated act or a tragic accident compounded by mismanagement and fear. You can almost hear the hushed speculation in council chambers, the nervous glances exchanged among courtiers, each weighing risk and loyalty against potential disaster. Then there are the more speculative fates, the fringe possibilities that mingle with myth. Some suggest that the princes were spirited away and hidden under new identities, perhaps to protect them from political intrigue or to leverage their existence in future power struggles. Quirky detail: a chronicler once reported that a local innkeeper claimed to have seen two boys matching their description, living quietly in the countryside, taught to identify themselves only with secret signs. A story historians largely dismiss, but one that continues to intrigue. Even contemporaries struggle to imagine the possibilities. You can almost sense the collective anxiety. Mothers clutching children tighter, apprentices pausing in games, and the tower guards moving with an extra weight in their steps. The lack of confirmation created fertile ground for rumor, giving rise to numerous theories about secret deaths, clandestine escapes, or even supernatural protection. Quirky fact: a fringe account claimed that the princes were whisked away by a spectral figure in the tower's chapel, a fantastical idea that illustrates the desperate hope and terror surrounding their absence. The political implications of each fate are immense. If murdered, the act underscores Richard III's ambition and ruthlessness, justifying the Tudor narrative that villainy had eliminated rightful heirs. If hidden, it suggests clandestine plotting, protection schemes, or even long-term political leverage, raising questions about loyalty, morality, and foresight in a turbulent era. You can almost hear the silent calculations of nobles, the careful weighing of information, and the strategic murmurs that spread like invisible threads through the court. Historians still argue whether any single political actor bears full responsibility, or if the tragedy was an unavoidable consequence of complex circumstances. Over the centuries, claims of survival persist. Pretenders, known as the princes in the tower, imposters, appeared in various European courts, asserting knowledge of or identity with the missing boys. You can almost feel the excitement, fear, and skepticism these claims provoked. The way hope and opportunism intersected in politically charged ways. Mainstream historians generally dismiss these pretenders, noting inconsistencies and lack of corroborating evidence. Yet the stories endure, contributing to the enduring mystery. Forensic possibilities add another layer to speculation. The skeletal remains discovered centuries later in the tower's precincts offer some clues, but no certainty. You can almost sense the careful, tentative handling of bones, the painstaking analysis, and the persistent frustration at inconclusive evidence. Quirky detail. Amateur enthusiasts have speculated about secret genetic tests, lost artifacts, and even hidden manuscripts that might someday reveal the prince's true fate, blending science, imagination, and hope. The uncertainty of their fate shapes perception of Richard III and Tudor narratives alike. You can almost feel the moral tension, power, innocence, and political necessity intertwined in a story that refuses closure. Each possibility carries symbolic weight. Murder highlights cruelty and ambition. Survival underscores cunning, luck, or divine providence. Accidental death reflects the fragility of life and the vulnerability of children in adult power struggles. Historians still argue whether the psychological weight of these possibilities should influence our judgment of Richard III or the Tudor storytellers. Even today, imagining the prince's possible fates is like stepping into a shadowed corridor of the tower, where every creak, draft, and locked door hints at stories untold. You can almost hear centuries of speculation ripple through stone walls, whispered in libraries, debates, and novels, reminding us that history often lives in questions as much as in answers. Quirky detail. One novelist proposed that the princes were hidden under a false identity in a distant abbey, learning to live quietly as commoners. A creative theory that captures both the imagination and the melancholic longing for what might have been. Ultimately, the possible fates of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, remain a prism of history, rumor, and legend. You can almost feel the tension of those stone corridors, the lingering presence of vanished innocence, and the pull of unanswered questions. Historians still argue whether the truth will ever emerge, or whether the tower, with its shadows, walls, and secrets, will forever guard the final fate of the two princes. Richard III's shadow of guilt hangs over the tower and the kingdom like a low, gray fog, creeping into every corridor, court chamber, and whispered conversation. You can almost feel it brushing against the nape of your neck, the weight of centuries pressing down on imagination and memory alike. You probably won't survive imagining the intensity of suspicion without sensing the cold tingle of intrigue threading through stone walls and human hearts. Contemporary accounts are quick to attribute blame. Mainstream historians note that Tudor chroniclers solidified Richard III's reputation as the primary suspect in the prince's disappearance, emphasizing ambition, cunning, and ruthless pursuit of power. You can almost hear the soft scratching of quills in candlelit chambers as writers, perhaps with a mix of fear and political motivation, shape the narrative that the king's brother orchestrated murder. Quirky detail. One chronicler claimed that Richard walked nightly through the tower's corridors, muttering to himself, "Where are they now?" A dramatic flourish that may reflect folklore more than reality, yet it haunts popular imagination. The court itself is tense, as nobles gauge Richard's intentions and attempt to navigate a minefield of potential danger. You can almost hear the whispered theories, the subtle clinking of goblets in shadowed chambers, and the shuffling of parchment as courtiers debate loyalty, morality, and survival. Historians still argue whether Richard's actions were calculated acts of cruelty or pragmatic maneuvers to secure the realm in turbulent times. Richard's public image is further complicated by his efforts to legitimize Edward I's removal from power. You can almost sense the careful orchestration of appearances, the nuanced decisions about which rumors to allow to flourish and which to suppress, and the calculated use of legal forms and public statements. Quirky fact. Some chroniclers report that Richard staged a small ceremony to inspect the prince's chambers, presenting it as concern, while subtly reinforcing his control over perception, a psychological move that blends practicality with propaganda. Suspicion spreads beyond the tower. Citizens, merchants, and even clergy speculate about Richard's motives, creating a pervasive atmosphere of fear and intrigue. You can almost hear the low hum of gossip winding through the streets of London, each retelling coloring the Duke's reputation with suspicion and moral judgment. Historians still argue whether the intensity of public suspicion accurately reflects Richard's culpability or the amplification of Tudor-era propaganda. Even allies in the court tread carefully. You can almost feel the tension as they balance ambition, loyalty, and self-preservation, knowing that association with the missing princes or with Richard himself could be dangerous. Mainstream accounts suggest that this pervasive unease allowed Richard to consolidate power while appearing both protective and authoritative. Quirky detail. One account describes a servant allegedly seeing Richard's shadow stretch like a serpent across the chamber floor, a metaphorical image that underscores fear and the impression of malice rather than documenting reality. Richard's shadow of guilt also penetrates posterity. You can almost sense historians, novelists, and playwrights centuries later circling his figure with suspicion, weaving moral and political interpretation into the fabric of his reputation. Historians still argue whether Richard's reputation as a villain is justified by evidence, or whether it has been exaggerated by Tudor chroniclers. Literary dramatization and popular imagination. Even today, walking the tower or reading accounts of the period, you can almost feel the tension between moral certainty and historical ambiguity. Every stone, corridor, and locked door seems to echo with the unresolved question of guilt, magnifying the psychological weight of absence and suspicion. Quirky fact: one modern tour guide claims that visitors sometimes feel a cold presence in the prince's supposed chambers, a lingering suggestion of guilt that continues to fascinate and spook audiences, blending storytelling with the sensory experience of history. The shadow of guilt is inseparable from the narrative of the missing princes. You can almost feel it shaping every retelling, every historical analysis, and every dramatic interpretation. A reminder that absence can be as powerful as action, and reputation as enduring as bones. Historians still argue whether the shadow reflects reality or the cumulative effect of rumor, propaganda, and centuries of interpretation. Ultimately, Richard III's shadow of guilt illustrates the interplay of ambition, perception, and moral judgment in history. You can almost sense it pressing on the tower's walls and on the minds of all who study this period, a spectral reminder that power, suspicion, and absence are threads that can shape memory, narrative, and historical legacy for centuries. In the centuries that follow, the mystery of the princes sparks modern searches and DNA investigations, bringing science into a centuries-old web of rumor, suspicion, and imagination. You can almost feel the sterile chill of laboratories contrasting with the damp, cold stone of the tower. The faint hum of fluorescent lights replacing the flicker of candle flames. You probably won't survive imagining the meticulous patience of scientists and historians alike, without sensing the quiet thrill of discovery mingled with the persistent shadow of uncertainty. Skeletal remains discovered in the tower's precincts in the 17th century rekindle interest, but it is not until modern forensic techniques arrive that serious scientific inquiry becomes possible. Mainstream historians note that these bones, small and delicate, are tentatively identified as belonging to children of the right age to be Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. You can almost hear the careful brushing of dust, the precise measurement of bone length, and the low hum of carbon dating machines as evidence is scrutinized with modern rigor. Quirky detail: some amateur investigators have created elaborate charts and family trees mapping every conceivable twist in the prince's potential fate, including fanciful claims linking them to obscure, noble lineages across Europe. A mixture of enthusiasm, obsession, and historical imagination. DNA testing offers tantalizing possibilities. You can almost sense the anticipation as geneticists compare mitochondrial DNA from the remains with living descendants of the royal line, aware that a match could finally resolve a question that has haunted historians for generations. Historians still argue whether current DNA results definitively identify the bones, or if contamination, incomplete lineage records, and the passage of centuries complicate any conclusions. The investigation also intersects with archaeology. You can almost feel the careful excavation of tower floors, the gentle uncovering of soil layers, and the measured steps taken to preserve context, ensuring that every fragment is accounted for. Quirky detail. One researcher jokingly suggested using a small remote-controlled robot to explore hidden corners of the tower, blending modern technology with centuries-old mysteries, though the idea remained more whimsical than practical. Even as science enters the picture, ambiguity persists. Some evidence supports the identification of the skeletons as the missing princes, while other findings suggest alternative explanations, including the possibility that the remains belong to unrelated children who died in the tower. You can almost hear the careful debate in conferences, papers, and online forums, scholars parsing every detail and weighing probabilities. Historians still argue whether forensic evidence alone can ever resolve the question definitively, or whether historical interpretation will always play a necessary role. Public fascination mirrors scientific inquiry. You can almost feel the excitement as documentaries, exhibitions, and news stories bring the mystery into contemporary consciousness, blending cutting-edge techniques with the human desire for narrative closure. Quirky detail. Some tourists, inspired by DNA revelations, leave tiny toy knights or coins near the princess's supposed burial sites, a modern ritual echoing centuries of legend, superstition, and homage. The science also reframes historical debates. You can almost sense the recalibration of opinions. Supporters of Richard III scrutinize evidence to assess credibility, while critics evaluate whether the identification confirms Tudor-era claims or merely adds nuance to an already complex narrative. Mainstream historians emphasize that DNA does not erase the layers of interpretation, bias, and folklore that have built up over centuries. Even with technology, the tower holds its secrets. You can almost hear the silent witness of stone corridors, the faint creak of ancient stairs, and the lingering suggestion that not all answers will ever be tangible. The investigation blends modern rationality with enduring mystery, a reminder that absence, suspicion, and imagination are as much a part of history as bones, parchment, and testimony. Ultimately, modern searches and DNA testing provide the closest brush with certainty the world has yet achieved. You can almost feel the tension between what science can reveal and what history keeps hidden, the quiet thrill of potential discovery tempered by the persistent ambiguity that has made the story of Edward Thieve and Richard, Duke of York, so enduring. Historians still argue whether these scientific tools resolve the mystery or simply add another layer of fascination, proof, and speculation to an already enigmatic tale. The mystery of the missing princes reverberates far beyond the tower, echoing through literature, theater, art, and popular imagination for centuries. You can almost feel the ripples traveling through time, brushing against the quills of playwrights, the canvases of artists, and the minds of readers and viewers. A persistent hum of intrigue that refuses to fade. You probably won't survive imagining how deeply their story has permeated culture without sensing the thrill of enduring fascination and the melancholy of absence. From Shakespeare onward, the princes are woven into dramatic retellings. Mainstream historians note that Richard III's character in Elizabethan drama is directly influenced by Tudor narratives, casting him as a villain whose ambition led to the presumed murder of his nephews. You can almost hear the voices of actors, the creak of stage boards, and the audience holding their breath as the story unfolds in candlelit theaters, the tension magnified by centuries of moral framing. Quirky detail. One early play imagined the princes as tiny shadows flitting across the stage, visible only to the audience. A creative choice meant to emphasize their innocence and vulnerability. Visual arts also respond to the mystery. You can almost see the painted faces of young princes staring from canvases in stately homes and public galleries, their expressions frozen in uncertainty, innocence, and foreboding. Artists through the centuries embellish or reinterpret features to reflect popular belief, Tudor spin, or personal imagination. Historians still argue whether these artistic depictions reinforce historical myths or provide insight into contemporary perceptions of the prince's plight. Even modern culture embraces the story. You can almost feel the tension as novelists, filmmakers, and historians mix fact and fiction, constructing narratives that balance suspense, politics, and psychology. Quirky fact: a graphic novel reimagines the princes escaping the tower to live secretly among the common people, blending historical speculation with whimsical adventure, showing how the story continues to inspire imagination and reinterpretation. Public fascination persists in everyday life. You can almost hear guided tours at the tower, the hushed whispers of visitors, and the soft tread of footsteps as people move through rooms and corridors that once held the vanished princes. Even souvenirs, reenactments, and interactive exhibits reflect the enduring cultural presence of Edward the Fide and Richard, Duke of York. Historians still argue whether popular fascination helps preserve history or distorts understanding by emphasizing legend over evidence. The story's resonance extends to scholarship and debate. You can almost feel the vibration of discussion in seminar rooms, online forums, and conferences as academics dissect narrative, propaganda, and surviving records while considering the cultural impact of the mystery. Quirky detail. One historian organized a playful Princes in the Tower quiz night for students, using both historical facts and enduring myths. A reminder that even education can embrace the story's cultural echo with humor and engagement. Even beyond England, the narrative travels. You can almost sense French, American, and global readers, audiences, and scholars interacting with the prince's story, fascinated by the political drama, moral tension, and human tragedy that transcends borders and centuries. The narrative transforms into a symbol of vanished innocence, fragile authority, and the shadows that ambition can cast. By the end of this cultural journey, the missing princes are more than historical figures. You can almost feel their presence in stories, performances, and imaginations. A haunting yet inspiring thread, linking centuries of curiosity, moral reflection, and creative expression. Historians still argue whether the cultural echo should be treated as historical evidence, moral lesson, or imaginative artifact, but its influence is undeniable, threading together fact, legend, an enduring fascination. Despite centuries of investigation, speculation, and storytelling, the fate of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, remains an unsolved mystery, lingering like a shadow over the Tower of London and the corridors of history. You can almost feel the cold stone pressing in, the faint scent of aged timber and iron mixing with centuries of whispers and imagined footsteps. You probably won't survive contemplating the enduring uncertainty without sensing both the fascination and the haunting tension that surrounds every theory. Mainstream historians acknowledge that despite forensic analysis, DNA studies, and careful archival research, no definitive conclusion has been reached. The skeletal remains discovered beneath the tower, while compelling, provide tantalizing hints rather than absolute answers. You can almost hear the meticulous sorting of evidence, the careful measurement of bones, and the low hum of computer screens as geneticists compare mitochondrial DNA with distant living relatives. Quirky detail. Some enthusiasts have even drawn detailed maps of secret passageways and tunnels under the tower, speculating about hidden chambers, though none of these have been conclusively verified. The uncertainty fuels imagination. You can almost feel the tension in every retelling, every novel, play, or documentary that approaches the story with both reverence and curiosity. Some suggest murder at the hands of Richard III. Others propose survival under assumed identities, secret exile, or accidental death. Historians still argue whether any single scenario can be considered more likely, or whether the true fate will forever remain unknowable. Political, cultural, and moral interpretations continue to intertwine with speculation. You can almost hear debates in classrooms, conferences, and online forums as scholars dissect Tudor narratives, contemporary chronicles, and forensic evidence, weighing motives, probabilities, and biases. Quirky fact. One imaginative theory even suggests that the princes were secretly spirited to a remote European monastery and raised as scholars, a narrative that captures public fascination more than historical credibility. Public fascination endures. You can almost sense visitors walking the tower corridors, whispering in front of the prince's supposed chambers, leaving tiny tokens or coins in homage, a modern ritual echoing centuries of curiosity, mourning, and speculation. The story persists in literature, television, films, and interactive media, blending evidence and imagination into a narrative that evolves with each generation. Historians still argue whether popular engagement helps preserve historical inquiry or contributes to the mythologizing of fact. Even the tower itself seems to bear witness, its stone walls silently observing centuries of speculation, research, and cultural reflection. You can almost hear echoes of vanished footsteps, the imagined laughter of boys long gone, and the faint creak of doors that may or may not have been locked on the night they disappeared. Quirky detail. Some modern guides claim that visitors sometimes experience a subtle chill or eerie sensation near the prince's former rooms, a reminder of how story, memory, and imagination intertwine in the physical space. Ultimately, the unsolved mystery endures because it encapsulates the fragile intersection of power, innocence, ambition, and human curiosity. You can almost feel the tension of unanswered questions pressing across centuries, shaping moral lessons, inspiring art, and haunting historical consciousness. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, will ever be fully explained, or whether it will remain a permanent shadow in English history. The story of the princes is, in essence, a story of absence. You can almost sense the presence of missing voices in every chronicle, letter, and artistic depiction. A reminder that what is unseen can exert influence as powerfully as what is known. Their lives, truncated and veiled in secrecy, continue to captivate, educate, and provoke reflection, connecting generations in a shared quest for truth and understanding. In the end, their mystery is part of what keeps history alive. The tension between fact and narrative, certainty and speculation, presence and absence. You can almost feel the centuries of intrigue vibrating through the tower's walls, a living testament to human curiosity, imagination, and the enduring allure of unanswered questions. The vanished princes, though never definitively accounted for, remain eternal figures in the shadowed intersection of history, legend, and collective memory. Even as we step back from the tower, the story of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, lingers like the faint echo of a bell across misty London streets. You can almost feel the centuries stretching beneath your feet, the cobblestones worn by footsteps that sought answers, whispered secrets, and imagined resolutions. The tower's stone walls hold the silence of vanished childhoods, the weight of ambition, and the hum of speculation that never dies. You probably won't survive thinking too long about the uncertainty without sensing a mixture of fascination, melancholy, and awe. Each theory, from murder to secret survival, carries its own logic, its own emotional resonance, and its own moral weight. You can almost hear the whispers of historians, the quill scratches of Tudor chroniclers, and the collective imaginings of generations who never stop asking, what truly happened? Even in our modern age of forensic science and DNA analysis, the prince's fate remains unresolved. This uncertainty is not a flaw in history. It is a feature, a reminder that some mysteries are larger than evidence, more enduring than documentation, and as compelling as any story ever told. Quirky detail. Visitors leave tiny coins or toy knights at the prince's supposed chambers. A subtle, human homage, blending curiosity, ritual, and empathy. As the lights dim and the tower recedes into memory, the story reminds us of the fragile line between innocence and power, absence and influence, myth and history. You can almost feel the echoes of vanished footsteps, the soft shuffle of pages, and the persistent hum of imagination carrying the mystery forward. So, take a deep breath. Let the tower's shadows settle in your mind. And remember, some stories are meant to endure, unresolved, not because we fail to understand, but because the tension between fact, legend, and imagination is what keeps history alive. Sweet dreams.